they sat down with me in London and said, can we have a talk about your future? I said, oh, my future's fine, mate. You want to talk about your future.
Right.
Because without me, you don't get funded.
Okay, now it becomes a career path. Now everyone that's doubted you, your boss, whatever, you can say, yeah, look, I did it. So what happened from there?
Yeah, I sort of, as I said, I was a young talent. Then I sort of delivered it as an elite talent. I came back after that 96 year winning Drummondville, and I did my first ever World Championships as an elite, and I got my doors blown off. And one of the older Australian guys who had been a world champion many years before took me under his wing and dragged me back home to train with him and his father.
Really?
And I spent 12 months under their guidance, and I literally went from a talent to a monster. I was unstoppable.
Yeah.
And
you went back to the US and won 33 consecutive triathlon races.
Yeah. I won world championships the following year. I was world number one all the way through to Sydney. My mum passed away just before the Sydney Olympics, on the eve of the Sydney Games. So the Australian Federation opted to drop me from the team. Didn't think I was mentally ready, which broke me. I promised my mother that I would win that race for her, or perform in that race for her, and win the Ironman in Hawaii. When the Federation dropped me, I took that as a real insult, considering
what you've accomplished. Yeah.
What I'd accomplished. I was their world champion. I was the current world number one. I'm like, how can you decide my destiny off what you think in a room? Like, I'll tell you if my head's in the right space or not.
They didn't have a conversation with you or anything.
They didn't have a conversation at all. They made a broad stroke decision that with the death of my mother and her being such a important part of my life, that I wouldn't be in the right headspace to win a gold medal for them, and they opted to take someone else. And that was it. I went up yours and I moved to the States. And that was when I went on a rampage, and 3 years without being defeated.
Yeah.
33 races from 33 starts. And I took every opportunity of every one of those races to call out my federation.
Right.
And that was where I guess I got the grizzly. A lot of people were like, oh man, this guy's talks a lot of smack.
Yeah. You had a chip on your shoulder. I
had a major chip on my shoulder, and that's where that all came from. And I think it was the key motivator that drove me to be so successful for those 3 years. And then the Federation ultimately called me to come back for Athens. And I said, look, I hadn't lost a race. I said, look, I'll go to Athens, but you need to pick me for the team now. I need to stay preparing where I'm preparing. I'm loving living in San Diego. And
sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you how does that conversation go with the same people that counted you out and put you off to the side, kind of?
Yeah, I got a phone. I'll never forget it. I came back and I won the Goodwill Games, which was a massive event here. It used to be run by Ted Turner, and it started when the Russians and the Americans were boycotting each other's Olympics. So Ted Turner came up with a great idea, and they had one in St. Petersburg, one in New York, they're all over, and every 4 years. And instead of it being like the Olympics, they would take the top 25 from every sport, would get to, and you race for huge money. And that last event was in London, and I won this Goodwill Games, which was a huge event. It was the biggest paying event in triathlon history at the time.
Wow.
And the Federation, that was like my 35th race win in a row. And they said, look, they sat down with me in London and said, can we have a talk about your future? I said, oh, my future's fine, mate. You want to talk about your future.
Right.
Because without me, you don't get funded.
Right.
I know the game now. I'm not a kid. So we sat down and they said, look, we want to bring you back in. We're sorry about what happened in Sydney, but there's new people in power here. And, the Athens course suits you. You're world number one. You can win. I said, 100%. I'll win the gold medal, but you need to put me in the team now. And we're 18 months out. I'm like, yeah, I get that, but there's no one going to dislodge me. There's 3 spots.
Yeah, of course.
4 spots. Let me take it and let me prepare entirely for Athens. And they said they couldn't do it. And I said, well, if you don't do it, I'll go to Ironman, which is not a decision I wanted to do. Because back then there was no other choice. There was no 70.3 Ironman. That didn't exist back then. There was either World Cup Olympic Games or Ironman races. And there was 10 Ironmans in the world. And they paid big money, and it was
So I don't understand this part though. Yeah, I don't know. How does this work in the sport? There was something called ITU, and then there's
ITU. ITU is the governing body that does the Olympic Games. ITU is basically the world governing. Ironman is a private enterprise, private company.
I gotcha.
That started an event called Ironman. So and triathlon both grew up, but the actual sport is owned by the ITU. Ironman just sold recently for $1 billion, right? The Chinese owned it. They just sold it again. It's a $1 billion company. And all they care about is revenue, money. So back then there was only 10 races, and it was starting to become private equity was starting to come in and buy it because they realized this triathlon thing was exploding. But back then, to win an Ironman you had some currency in that, right? It meant something. Now there's 300 Ironman. Everyone's done an Ironman. But back then, an Ironman was
Were the rules the same? Are the rules the same?
Rules the same. It's a very different now because there was always limiting around the amount of people you could have in a race. There was mass starts. Nowadays there's sort of safety. There's rolling starts, and two people get kicked in the face. It's a completely different sport. Back then there was 1,500 people in the water. Go. You did get kicked in the face. Yeah. That was part of the race. But now they have 2,500 people in a race. The drafting. It's a completely different sport. It's just a money making machine. But it's bigger sport now. But it had more. From a professional perspective, you had a lot more opportunity back when I was racing than you do today. Where the opportunities are more around the brand as opposed to the individual. But yeah, so what I was saying to the federation was, I'm going to leave and I'm going to go to that private enterprise. They want me anyway. They're trying to get me to come over here,
right?
And a little bit like UFC, I guess. I'm going to go fight for UFC.
Yeah, right? I wanted to draw some analogies with the UFC. We'll talk about that later. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm with these guys. I'm going to go fight the UFC, and they laughed and said, "Look, you're not cut out for that. You're too big. You're a power athlete. You're an ITU athlete. You're an Olympic champion style athlete, and all that testing shows you can't do Ironman."
Wait, they said that to you?
Yeah, and they'd done all the testing for years on me in my early days. I said, "Yeah, you can't do Ironman," and you know that. And I'm
so
like,
ridiculous.
You've left me with no choice. So I literally, they didn't put me on the team. So I entered Ironman and started my Ironman journey that day. I won my first Ironman against the world champion and went to Kona my first year in 2003 as the favorite, in 2002, 3. And I had a 13-minute lead off the bike and blew to pieces and walked and started my humbling career of Ironman racing in Kona because it was a completely different beast.